Picture this. You're standing at the edge of what used to be your grandfather's backyard. The oak tree is still there, barely, but the ground beneath your feet, gone, swallowed by brown water that keeps creeping closer, a few inches at a time, every single year. You're not in some far-off place that only exists in a documentary. You're in Louisiana, and the land disappearing under your feet is America's coast. Welcome to one of the most urgent, most human, and most quietly jaw-dropping stories happening right now in this country. Louisiana is sinking, and the people fighting to save it are its own fishermen, its indigenous communities, its scientists, and its engineers. This is their story. And spoiler alert, it's not just a tragedy. It might actually be a comeback. Let's start with the numbers, because they are genuinely absurd. About 80% of the nation's entire coastal land loss occurs right here in Louisiana. The state has been losing the equivalent of a football field every 15 minutes. Between 1932 and 2016, Louisiana's coastal parishes lost more than 2,000 square miles of land, roughly 25% of the wetland area that existed in 1932, an area equivalent to the entire state of Delaware, gone, underwater, in less than a century. And here's what people miss when they see those numbers on a screen. That's not just acreage. That is someone's shrimping ground. That is the bayou where a grandfather taught a grandson to cast a net before sunrise. Every square mile that disappears takes a piece of a life with it. So how did we get here? A slow-motion collision of nature, industry, and human engineering. One major driver is the strict leveeing of the Mississippi River, which interrupted the natural processes that built South Louisiana in the first place. For thousands of years, the Mississippi flooded its banks, dropped sediment, and literally built new land. We stopped that. We built walls. The river kept moving, but the land stopped growing. Add sea level rise, subsidence, saltwater intrusion, and you have a recipe for collapse. Then came the oil and gas industry. Thousands of canals cut for pipelines and drilling rigs turned solid marsh into open water. They let the salt in. Salt kills marsh grass. When the grass dies, the roots holding the soil together let go, and the land dissolves. But before we go further into the science, we need to talk about the people, because that's what this story is really about. Louisiana's seafood industry produces an economic impact of over $2.4 billion annually, and Louisiana's fishermen bring in the second largest volume of seafood by state, second only to Alaska. For more than 400 years, families have fished for shrimp and crab, reeled in catfish, and harvested oysters from coastal reefs, whether alone in a handmade cypress pirogue or with a crew aboard a 95-foot shrimp boat headed for open water. These families didn't choose a job. They inherited a way of life, and that way of life depends entirely on healthy wetlands. 75% of commercial fish and shellfish species in Louisiana depend on the state's wetlands for breeding and survival. Now imagine you've been shrimping the same stretch of bayou for 30 years, and year by year, the landmarks you navigate by just vanish. The nursery grounds where baby shrimp grew up? Open water now. The oyster beds your grandfather charted by hand? Buried under silt or drowned in salt water? Saltwater intrusion and wetland deterioration have been undermining the region's ecological health, threatening to diminish the livelihoods of coastal residents. Think about that for a second. If you were a fourth-generation shrimper watching your family's fishing grounds literally disappear, Would you stay and fight, or would you cut your losses and leave? Comment your answer below, because the choice these families face is exactly that stark, and what they decide shapes the entire future of this coast. Now here is where the story gets even more personal and more heartbreaking, because while fishing families are fighting to hold on, some indigenous communities have already passed the point of no return. Ile de Jean Charles is the ancestral home of the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation. What was once a thriving community with 400 residents on 22,000 acres has shrunk by 98%. The once 5-mile-wide island reduced to just half a mile and 320 acres. It didn't flood in a single dramatic storm. It just disappeared. Slowly, relentlessly. Cow pastures gone, rice fields gone, towering live oaks transformed into eerie gray skeletons by encroaching salt water. The community that called it home for centuries has been forced into an impossible negotiation, not just over where to move, but over whether moving means losing everything that made them who they are. Culture, identity, and connection to land are not things you can pack into a moving truck. This is the human cost that no spreadsheet captures. This is why the scientists and engineers working on coastal restoration will tell you, off the record, over coffee, that the pressure they feel isn't just professional, it's moral. They work under the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, the CPRA, created after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Their coastal master plan has 73 proposed projects aimed at lowering storm surge threats and maintaining a natural buffer between communities and the Gulf. Most involve dredging sediment and pumping it elsewhere to create marsh, ridges, and other natural features. A handful involve diverting Mississippi River water into nearby bays to reconnect to a natural source of fresh water and sediment. The boldest idea was the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, projected to restore over 13,000 acres of wetland habitat over 50 years, funded by $2.26 billion from BP's Deepwater Horizon settlement, the Gulf paying for its own healing in a way. But this year, that project was officially canceled. The CPRA determined it was no longer viable amid soaring costs, permit suspensions, and litigation. It was a gut punch to the scientific community and to environmental advocates who had spent years getting it off the ground. But here's the thing about Louisiana's coast. It does not wait for politics to sort itself out, and neither do the people fighting for it. Because even as the big diversion project collapsed, smaller ground-level work kept going, and it is working. 1 year after creating 1,170 acres of wetland habitat in the Barataria Basin, key species like shrimp and crab were returning. All target species, blue crab, brown and white shrimp, and red drum, were using the new water features and channels. It's amazing to already see not just fish in here, but there are tons of fishermen on the water, said one coastal ecologist at the Water Institute. That is the payoff, not on a graph, not in a government report. Fishermen on the water in a marsh that didn't exist 2 years ago. In 2025, the CPRA completed 12 projects valued at $363 million, restoring and enhancing more than 9,200 acres of wetlands. And in July 2025, the Louisiana legislature unanimously approved a record $1.98 billion investment in coastal restoration and protection, the largest single-year investment in the program's history. Bipartisan, in this political climate. That tells you something about how seriously Louisiana takes this fight. The stakes go far beyond state lines. Louisiana holds more than 4 million acres of wetlands, 40% of the nation's total. Hurricane protection supplied by those wetlands has been estimated at over $23 billion for the United States. Lose Louisiana's coast, and you lose a natural barrier protecting the entire Gulf South from catastrophic storms. You lose nursery grounds for seafood that feeds the whole country. You lose living culture, the Zydeco and the gumbo, and generations of knowledge about how to read water and weather and tide. But here is what this story ultimately is. It is about people who refuse to be statistics. A shrimper who wakes before dawn and heads out on the same water his father worked, even as the shoreline has changed beyond recognition. An indigenous elder who can point to where her grandmother's house stood, 20 feet underwater now, and still speak about this land with love instead of just grief. A young engineer who chose Louisiana over a better-paying job somewhere else because this problem is real and it matters and someone has to solve it. The coast is not saved yet. The challenges are enormous. The politics are messy and the clock is always running. But the marsh is coming back in places where scientists said it would take decades. The fish are returning, the fishermen are following, and the people who have the most to lose are still here, still fighting, still casting their nets into the future. Louisiana's coast has been disappearing for nearly a century. The question is no longer whether we can stop it. The evidence says we can. The question is whether we have the will to do it fast enough, at the scale that's needed, for the people who need it most. If this story moved you, and it should, share this video with someone who thinks environmental stories are just about animals and abstractions. Because this one is about people, and their home, and the remarkable, hard-won, still fragile evidence that it's not too late.